Welcome to season 11 of How to Start Up, the podcast helping you start and scale your business with advice from entrepreneurs on what to do now, next, or never. This season, we'll be hearing about all things productivity from amazing entrepreneurs sharing how they've hacked theirs. Hosted by me, Juliet Fallowfield, founder of the B Corp certified PR communications and podcasting consultancy, Fallowfield and Mason. Our mission is to enable you to master your own storytelling, whether that be via PR or podcasting, all with a long-term view. 70% of us use phones for work, yet we all know how much they can distract us. As productivity is crucial for any business, I wanted to speak with an expert to help manage this necessary evil. Dr Kristy Goodwin is a Neuro-Performance Scientist and Australia's leading expert on peak performance in the digital age. Her book, Dear Digital, We Need to Talk, enables individuals and organisations to enhance the performance and productivity in the digitally intense world that we live in and conquer tech distractions. Keep listening to hear Dr Kristy's advice on how to use digital tools to help and not hinder us, how to work in tandem with your neurobiology to achieve your goals, and why rest is really a superpower. Okay, first question. How would you define peak performance?
To me, peak performance is being able to achieve your goals, to perform at, and I think the key word here, as a sustainably high level. I think a lot of people can give you hacks and tips to perform at a high level, but the real, I think, marker of ultimate success is sustainable success. In its purest form is living in close proximity to your values. So if you are a high performer, you can meet your success metrics, you can achieve your goals, but can do so in a sustainable way. And the reason that I am just so passionate about this is because I have the privilege of working with a lot of high performers, entrepreneurs, leaders from the corporate world, people in startups. And what I see is that a lot of times people can achieve peak performance, but they cannot sustain it. Or if they do sustain it, they often pay what I call the success tax. The success tax is where we do achieve peak performance, but it's at the cost, it's at the expense of impaired mental health, physical well-being, or relationships, or the trifecta is all three. And so to me, peak performance is performing at whatever sustainable success looks like for you. And I think clearly also articulating what are your success metrics. I work with a lot of people. We discuss what are your goals, and sometimes they realize they're climbing the wrong mountain. They are halfway up a peak, not aware of what their measure of success is. And for some high performers, success is having a manageable workload where they can beat their caring and domestic responsibilities and fulfill their career aspirations. And the way that we do that is by living and working in ways that are congruent, not in conflict with our human operating system. I think many of us are trying to achieve peak performance, but we are not doing it in a way that is compatible with our neurobiology. And that is simply how we are designed to operate as humans. And so this is why we're seeing stress, rates of burnout, exhaustion, increased distractibility on the rise because we are living in ways that are completely incongruent with our HOS, our human operating system.
I love that because your human operating system should come before your laptop on your iPhone and all the other operating systems in our lives.
Yeah.
How would you advise a founder even start to tackle that and find that out for themselves?
I often say we cannot outperform our biological blueprint. As humans, unfortunately, we have some biological constraints. This is where I love working with high performers who often, and I was there once. The reason I'm so passionate about this is because I pushed myself and ultimately almost paid what I call the ultimate success tax. For years, I'd heard the whispers from my body to slow down, to work in a more sustainable pace, but I ignored those whispers until my body had no other option other than to shout at me. So I'd heard those whispers, work in a more sustainable pace, but I adopted the Codral advice of the 1980s and I soldiered on. And so I was working and living as somebody who had their own business. I was also at the height of the pandemic, juggling, trying to resurrect a speaking career and simultaneously tasked with the impossible job of homeschooling three young boys. My husband conveniently had been deemed an essential worker. And so I was sacrificing my sleep. I wasn't prioritizing recovery. I was go, go, go in that hustle and grind culture. And I had ignored those whispers until my body shut me down. I ended up in a code red emergency ward at the height of the pandemic, hooked up to a ventilator, unable to breathe. And doctors were at a loss to explain why was someone with no underlying health issues, a very fit, active woman in her early 40s, so adversely affected with COVID. And the only medical explanation was that I was burnt out. Years and years of stress that I had ignored mounted in chronic stress, and chronic unresolved stress leads to burnout. And our bodies keep score. And so I lay in that hospital bed, literally hooked up to a machine to keep me alive breathing. And I was forced to confront the fact that we cannot outperform our biology. We have to start living and working in ways that were compatible. And so I knew this. I used to speak about the research and science of our human operating system, but I actually thought I could find a hack or outperform it. And so it was that moment in time that forced me to recalibrate my values and to start living in close proximity to them. And so I completely turned my life around by better understanding our human operating system. How are our brains and bodies designed to function? A really simple example is that the part of our brain, it's called the prefrontal cortex. So the part of our brain that does our mentally heavy lifting work. It solves problems, it hypothesizes. I often say our prefrontal cortex is like the CEO of the brain. One of the constraints we have as humans is that our prefrontal cortex only has a 4 to 6 hour battery life per day. Now, some people hear this and misconstrue what I'm saying and say, oh, I've heard people talk about the 4 day work week, but this lady called Kristy said I should have a 4 hour workday. That is not what I am proposing. But for you, especially as an entrepreneur, as a leader, for you to do the mentally taxing work that you need to do, data analysis, forecasting, writing a proposal, analyzing
Sales.
trends, sales, yes, anything that requires some cognitive effort, you only have a 4 to 6 hour battery period per day. Now, of course, there are extenuating circumstances. It's the end of the financial year. You're launching a new product. Sometimes you do have to put in some extra hours. But if you are consistently trying to pump out 12 and 14-hour days, you are simply working against your human operating system. Another really simple example that determines how we should structure the contours and the cadence of our days is that as humans, we have something called an ultradian rhythm. And our ultradian rhythm means that we naturally, as humans, have roughly a 90-minute period while we're awake where we're quite focused and alert. We will then inevitably, whether we like it or not, hit roughly a 20-minute trough where our focus starts to wane, our energy starts to drop. We see an increase in what we call glucocorticoids. We start to fatigue. Now, that is part of our neurobiology. Can we structure the rhythm and the contours and the architecture of our day so that it works in harmony with that rather than in conflict with it? So, can we work in what I call digital dashes? Can we sprint and then recover? Sprint and then recover. And it's roughly 90 minutes, give or take, 20 minutes either side. But can we start to structure our days how we work and then we do something in that 20-minute trough? Now, don't again misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not saying you need to do 20 minutes on your yoga mat in the downward dog, because I know a lot of people would say I wouldn't get any work done if I sprinted for 90 minutes and then was upside down for 20. What we are designed to do in that 20-minute trough is at least 2 to 10 minutes. It needs to be something restorative. The other proportion of that remaining sort of 20-minute trough where our energy is not at its peak, we're not in an alert focused state, is we can start to do some less taxing, less cognitively demanding, more administrative types of work. If you're familiar with Cal Newport's work, he talks about shallow work. So that's when you could tackle some of those tasks so that when you hit your next peak, you have given your brain the space and the time that it needs to replenish itself so that you can perform at a high level. But what I see many people who are trying to achieve peak performance, they're under this misnomer that more is more. And so they keep pushing and they work against, not with their human operating system.
Which ultimately then doesn't do anybody any favors. And I remember
No.
someone in the podcast said to me that you've got to look after yourself because you're not going to look after your business or your team if you don't put yourself first.
Yeah.
And that health, and in fact, our health and wellness season was the highest performing season we've ever done.
Yeah.
And every single nutrition, mobility, sleep, everyone said sleep is number one and then everything else is important underneath. But for that 4 to 6 hours, are you saying that if you then do the sprint of an hour and a half and then you do restorative 20 minutes, you then buy yourself more in that or is it max 6 a day?
Exactly. So I say for really sustainable peak performance, 4, absolutely most 6 of those 90-minute sprints at an absolute maximum. I usually recommend four. Four solid 90-minute sprints is a really robust amount of work that you could get done that is working with your human operating system per day. If you ignore that and you just keep going and going, it's what we call the law of diminishing returns. So we've all done that. We've all pumped out a massive 14-hour day, and we look at the quality and the type of work we produce at the tail end of that day, and it is terrible. And so we have to, I think, start to reconceptualize, especially in our modern world where we are predominantly knowledge workers. We are remunerated and generate our worth through our ideas. So it's all about outcomes, not hours. But I think many of us has still got an industrialized model of productivity where the number of hours I work equates to how productive I have been. That is outdated, redundant.
It's so interesting to say this. So I'd recruited in COVID, in lockdown, remotely, and I had suddenly this newfound freedom that I could set up a work culture that I wanted to work for me, which meant I could travel. Two of my team members had never worked for anyone else. They came straight from university. They've always worked hybrid and remote, that in their 2-3 years of career. But even they said, we like knowing the hours we owe you. So we know we've done a good enough job, because we don't know what a good day at work looks like because we've never been in an office. And the only way they could give themselves that boundary was with hours. And I said, well, to be honest, I don't care how long it takes you, as long
Yes.
as you're not working 60 hours a day. If you get the job done and it's at good standard, I'm thrilled. And go to the
Yeah.
gym at lunch and go for that long walk. And
Yes.
we track our time with toggles. So we've got a podcasting toggle, a reading toggle, a walking toggle. And one of my team members came back to a team meeting and said, oh, this thing was so annoying me. I couldn't get anywhere. And I just put my laptop down and went for a really long walk. And I've got 10 ideas and 5 solutions. And
Yes.
I was like, I wish I'd followed my own advice, because it's so lovely to see them work in this new way. But for them, they didn't want the guilt of not doing their job or day job.
Yeah.
And I think that I've had 20 years when I work for other people, and I'd be 48 weeks of the year in an office, Monday to Friday, before my boss turned up and then after my boss would leave. And that was a good day. But
Yeah.
now output, what you said about output, it's everything when you start a business, but it's
Yeah.
the hardest thing to quantify when you are starting a business. Invariably, it is a new business. You haven't
Yeah.
done it before. You don't know what good looks like.
Yeah.
How do you manage that overwhelm? I think that's the part that I'm so interested in, is that we want more focus. We want to be more productive, which is an awful word. And everyone said, steer away from that. What does good look like for you?
Well, I want to just circle back. I'm happy to answer that
Yeah.
question, but you said something that I think is just so overlooked, but I want to share the science to encourage, and this will inevitably help you dilute some of the overwhelm that you might be experiencing. When you mentioned before, I'm not sure if it was yourself or a colleague that went for a walk and all of these ideas germinated. We are designed as humans, the fancy term that neuroscientists call is something called the default mode network. And it's a really unique function in our brain that is activated when we are bored, when we are idle. And we know it is particularly amplified when we are walking, when we're in the shower, when we're on a plane or a train or a tram. And what happens is when we create optic flow, so when things move past our eyes, as they do when we're walking or in the shower, it quietens down part of our brain called the amygdala, which is often the worry center, and it allows ideas to germinate. I often ask
Well,
people in keynotes, where were you when your last genius solution to a problem that you spent months agonizing over, where were you and what were
not
you
one.
doing when that idea came? And I have never, of the tens of thousands I've spoken to, I have never had one person who've said to me, "Oh, in an Excel spreadsheet, in my
Yeah.
inbox."
On doom scroll.
Overwhelmingly, yes, it is when I'm in the shower is the most common form, or going for a walk, or on holidays with no Wi-Fi.
Yes.
And so we have to,
No.
I think, more than ever, fiercely protect that time for germination, that time for our minds to meander and see it as an absolutely integral part of our lives. I was coaching a client who was a CEO a couple of years ago, and we talked about this default mode network. And he acknowledged that he could see the merits in it. But he said, Kristy, my EA is going to think that I look very odd and very unprofessional if I write daydreaming in my calendar. He said, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to protect that time, but I'm going to call it activation of default mode network time. He said, it makes me look fancier and everyone
Yeah.
will be impressed. And I don't feel awkward about time blocking that in my calendar. He came back to me a couple of years ago and said, I had to move that time around. He said, sometimes it was me going for a surf. Sometimes it was me going for a walk, not listening to anything. Sometimes it was me sitting in a cafe, just journaling or brainstorming ideas. He said, one of those times where I was board or that activation of the default
Yeah.
mode network, an idea came to me that generated my business $25 million. He said, I would never have come up with that idea if I'd always been going, if I'd never had that
Yeah.
percolation time. And so I think for a lot of people, we have again diluted the value, we've overlooked the importance of having mental white space for our minds to meander.
And I think the problem I found, and I love setting up the business because it was all new and exciting, and I was problem solving, and I was building a website, and I was learning how to
Yeah.
invoice people. It was all laptop based, and it was
Yeah.
all a screen and needed internet. And it was in lockdown. So I was in a good routine of getting up, went for a walk with my mum. Then I did some exercise. Then we had breakfast together. She went off and wrote her book. I went off and did my work. And that morning time with her, we both said we were so much better throughout the rest of our day because we'd
Mm.
had some time away from thinking about the actual problem. Our brains were relaxed and thinking about
Yes.
other things and talking about other things and sharing ideas about other things and being in dialogue about stuff that was nothing to do with our day jobs.
Yes.
But I think I love what you said about being in motion because I've clocked that I love working from a train. And I've recently had the
Mm.
opportunity to go on 2 epic cruises to the Arctic and Antarctic, and being in motion.
Yeah.
And my brain has never been happier. I always just thought, oh, maybe I'm just a transit person. I love travel, but brains actually like having that
Yeah.
stimulation. I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah. And so there's rigorous science. That's what I try and say to people. Like, we're as humans, we can't outperform that human operating system. So we are designed, and you said something then, the fact that you used to have great ideas when you're on a cruise. One of the things that we know is that our digital habits, and again, professionally and personally, and I think they've become enmeshed together. It's hard
Mm,
to draw lines of demarcation between this is my professional and my personal use. But because we are spending hours and hours a day on our screens, our laptops, our desktops, our
mm,
smartphones, our tablets, what happens is our eyes have to converge on a relatively small surface area. As humans, we are neurobiologically designed for our eyes to dilate, to look in the distance. The reasons that we know, and often I say to people, I believe we have a silent stress epidemic. The World Health Organization says that our next epidemic is stress. We are seeing
mm,
global rates of stress and burnout on the increase. And I think our tech habits are one of the chief, they're certainly not the only reason, but our digital habits often are invisible. Subtle digital habits are contributing. And what's happening is when we are spending hours a day with our eyes converged on a relatively small surface area, like our laptops or our screens, it triggers the stress response because we are designed as humans for our eyes to dilate, to look in the distance, to stare at objects in the distance. And so that's why we tend to feel much more relaxed when we're in nature. That's why going for a walk, sitting on a cruise liner, looking at things in the distance calms down our brains. It drops our stress response. Another thing that is often happening, and again, a very invisible but pervasive way that technology is elevating our stress, is
mm.
that as humans, we are neurobiologically designed to sigh every 5 minutes while we're awake. It's a natural biological mechanism that regulates our stress response. We regulate our oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. So it should be 2 inhalations through our nose and we exhale through our mouth. And it's not the exaggerated hand on the hip, eye roll, I'm very exasperated sigh. It is just a natural thing we should do every 5 minutes. However, again, when our eyes converge on that small surface area, it triggers the stress response. We do not sigh anywhere near as much when we're looking at our screens. And so this means we are literally holding our breath. There has been a condition studied called email apnea, where people go into their inboxes, literally hold their
Yeah.
breath, dump a whole lot of cortisol, pupils accelerate, pupils dilate, they have that physiological response. So
Yeah.
I think part of our overwhelm is coming from our unquestioned digital habits. And you mentioned before what a beautiful morning routine you had during the height of the pandemic with your mum. I often encourage people, especially if you know the demands of your day are going to be intense, start the day upright. One of the problems is many of us wake up, and research suggests that most of us pick up our phone before we talk to our partners in the morning. And so, what we do, we often pick up our phones, we check emails, we check social media, we check news reports, we check the weather, we elevate our stress response. We actually activate a part of our brain called the beta brain state, which is the busy brain state.
Mm.
And we haven't had a cup of tea. Our feet haven't touched the ground. And so what we've done also is raise our baseline levels of dopamine. We get the quick fix from the DMs that we see. We triage our inbox. We get some quick hits of dopamine from something funny we see on social media. So what we're doing is raising our level of dopamine and at the same time elevating our cortisol response. And this is a recipe for disaster for modulating a calm, controlled presence. What do? We slip into overwhelm. And so we get to the office and then we're triaging Teams messages or Teams chats. We go from back to back virtual meeting.
It's all reactive. Nothing's proactive.
Yes. And so Microsoft coined this fabulous term to describe a phenomenon that I think many people are stuck in, and that is digital debt. People are in this perpetual state of digital debt, like it's a digital deluge. And so this clouds our judgment and this further perpetuates this cycle of overwhelm. Microsoft usage data, so not self-reporting, but global usage data, says that 57% of knowledge workers' days today is spent doing work about work. I call it the 3 M's: meetings, messages, and email. Then a mere 43% of our day is actually doing the work that we're supposed to be doing. And when we don't get the work that we're supposed to have got done that day, that perpetuates our to-do list and the overwhelm. And yes, we know this is why many people, again, when we have unresolved daytime stress, it leads to really poor sleep. If you are waking up repeatedly between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning, it is a clear sign that you have often got unresolved daytime stress, because what we know is 2 to 3 a.m. is where our cortisol naturally just starts to increase, so that when we hit the early hours of the morning and we want to wake up, we've got a nice peak in that cortisol. But if our cortisol is already high because we've got all this unresolved stress, I didn't triage my inbox, I know there's a whole lot of messages, I've got a back-to-back series of virtual meetings tomorrow. When we've got that chronic elevated stress already, when we get a hit at 2 and 3 a.m. of more cortisol, it overflows. So we can't then fall back asleep. And then poor sleep, as I know you've heard in other podcasts, contributes and exacerbates overwhelm. And so we're trapped almost in this vicious, and I often say people are living today where they are always on, they are rarely focused, never recovered. Always on, really focused, and never recovered. And one of the reasons is because we are living in ways and working in ways that are totally incongruent with our human operating system.
And this is something we cannot ignore. You will burn out. But I'm typically very proactive and organized and getting lots of shit done. But in communications and podcasting, it's a very proactively behaved industry. So you can never do enough. And this friend of mine is the ultimate social butterfly. She's incredibly wonderful at doing lots of lovely things, lots of lovely people. But I said to her, I worry that you're not giving yourself time to think things through. You're busying your diary so much to the point that you've never got any time on your own, that you can never actually just sit and digest the coffee you just had with somebody, the mental conversation rather than the caffeine, and think it through to the end. And that expression, and especially in business where you actually have to spend quite a lot of time just thinking things through to get to the end. And my analogy at the moment, given I've moved house, is at that point I've unpacked all the boxes, I've fixed all the things I can fix, but now I just have to sit and think and work out reconfigurating rooms or anything like that, because I need to think about it. And thinking time is a luxury, but I think it's something that, from what you're saying about looking out to the distance, going for the walk, that's actually really good restorative time for our brains, and we need it.
Yes.
We need it to survive.
I want to say two things here. Again, we often see rest as frivolous, or it's something we'll do when we finally take the holiday that we never take, or I'll do it on Sunday afternoon. or I wait till I collapse and I'm in hospital to actually say, hey, I should probably rest. Gartner research tells us that, and this was based on a significant population size, that if we take proactive rest, we are 26% more productive. And so it's not just a well-being nice to have, it's actually a performance lever. And so I often get people, especially high performers, I talk about rest and recovery being what I call a peak performance pit stop.
We, in 2024, I don't drive race cars, but my understanding is that they are so technically and mechanically sophisticated that they no longer need to pull in to take a pit stop. They could finish the entire race without ever pulling in and changing tires, or changing and replacing oil or drivers. But the reason that they do still take pit stops is that they want that race car finishing that race in an optimal state. They do not want it crawling to the finish line. And so I
Yeah.
think as high performers, we have to reframe this dialogue. Rest is a right and it's a responsibility, it's not a reward.
If it makes you more productive and you're better at your job and your output is better, every founder is now going to do it. And I think that's the thing, is every founder is clawing to find more time, more
Yeah.
efficiencies, more process, more productivity. And I interviewed the founder of Click who upcycles tech. And he said, it's fine. I can go to a CFO and I can tell him I'm saving money. It doesn't even matter to him about the environment, but I know I'm saving the environment by doing what I'm doing. If you give someone a better reason that you're speaking their language.
It's huge. And so, again, it's about working with rather than against our human operating system. So, part of this is pushing back against the dominant paradigm, that productivity, outdated metrics of productivity, that more is more. Sometimes we have to slow down so that we can speed up. And again, it's antithetical to the way we've been conditioned. But if we want to not only just achieve peak performance, but if we want to sustain it and not pay the success tax, we have to start living and working in ways that are compatible with this HOS.
So the 26%, we actually find these efficiencies and it's better for us. And we've talked a lot about the damage we can do if we don't listen to our human operating system.
Mhm.
If you had a magic wand for anyone in business, what would you suggest they do with their day to be
Yes.
looking after themselves?
I love this question. So, I often talk about, I believe, for sustainable peak performance, there are three core pillars. The first pillar is that we have to reframe recovery. We have to stop seeing recovery as frivolous, and recovery includes sleep, it also includes rest. The second pillar of sustainable peak performance is that we have to optimize what I believe is the super skill of the 21st century. For years, we were told that a person's IQ predicted their lifelong success. And then in more recent times, we said, no, their EQ, their emotional intelligence was a predictor of their success. The new super skill, I believe, that trumps a person's IQ and EQ is their FQ. And I have to be careful how I say that one, your focus quotient.
Your capacity to orient, control, and direct your attention and focus in a digitally demanding world that has been engineered, deliberately engineered to be distracting and disruptive is just such a potent super skill. And the third skill is all around how do we build our stress tolerance and resilience? Given that we are living in a world that is increasingly more stressful, how can we develop our capacity to hold more stress and to be resilient to stress so that when we do tackle a challenging situation that we can respond rather than react? And so I think if we can start to master those three pillars, we can achieve sustainable peak performance. And so it's about giving people what I call a menu of micro habits. What are the small little things that we can do to drive our performance? There was, and I hope you don't mind me circling, I was trying to think of something you said before and the idea has just come back. So you were talking before about how people often have back-to-back meetings and really demanding days. I shared something recently that really resonated with people about how we need more margins in our days. And I had a friend who used to say to me, we need to allow margins for the magic. And so we need to make sure we have white space in our days, calendars, weeks where the ideas can percolate. We've got time for that thinking. You said before, seeing an idea through to completion or having a full thought process. The other part I say to people, and again, this is where I think people often elevate their stress, is because not only do they not have margins in their days for magic, they also don't have margins in their days to clean up the mess. So that when a meeting goes longer than expected, when you get an angry email from a client or a customer, if you have already got a very time compressed calendar, I often say if moving a meeting then looks like playing a game of Tetris, your calendar has no margins. I've changed that saying that we need to allow margins for the magic and the mess. And so I think we, again, need to come back and start to question even the concept of a 40-hour week. I mean, no person who owns their own business probably ever has worked a 40-hour week. But we have to, I think, question that really dominant framework. We are so attached to the hours worked rather than the outcomes that we're achieving.
And it needs to be mapped into the business plan. Lots of people have great ideas and a lot of businesses fail because they don't have cash flow, but people think they can just outwork the problem. And
Yes.
actually, if you're going to give yourself burnout, your business model is not sustainable.
Yeah.
So don't do it. But I don't
Yeah.
want to discourage people from starting the business. And what I love about this podcast, it's encouraging people to do it, but in a really realistic way. And a lot of people said,
Yes.
there will be a weight of responsibility. You have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
There will be a lot of pressure, but you learn how to manage that. And you have to be very honest with how you cope with stressful situations and support yourself. And for me, it would be waking up, meditating, doing some exercise before I even opened a screen. Do I do that? No. And I am my own worst enemy, but I know that about myself. And this conversation, in fact, every single podcast episode has been a bit of an awakening for me of just follow these experts' advice and you'll be okay. And that comfort in that you can still do this and you can enjoy it. And I think that leaving the margin is so interesting because you enjoy your job more because you have time
Yes.
to actually relish that problem you want to solve.
Yeah. Or when you do have to clean up the mess, let's face it, that's not a fun part. But if there is so much time pressure that you're not going to be able to do that, the due diligence you need to do to respond appropriately, then again, it elevates our stress. And so we are, I think, stuck in this vicious cycle where we are not. I often talk about how we need to work smarter so we can work harder. And I think there's been a lot of people saying, oh, you don't need to work hard, vision board your way to success or manifest your way
Manifest
to the
it.
ideal. Yes. No, my philosophy is, and this is where the science comes in, let's work smarter so that you can work harder and not burn out in the process. Let's work smarter so you can work harder and enjoy the ride as you go. Let's work smarter so you can work harder so that you can reap the rewards without having a toll on your body or your brain or your relationships. And so that to me is exciting.
I was going to ask you, so before you answer the question, I'm going to say what we do in our team, and then you're going to tell me it's either good or bad.
No pressure.
A lot of clients want to get me on their Slack, and I'm like, no, we use email and phone calls. We don't use WhatsApp. We don't use Instagram. We don't have any notifications. If you want me and it's urgent, phone me. Otherwise, I'll wait for your email. And they're like, oh. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not giving my team any more overwhelm than we already have.
Yep.
And the notification thing, I can't stand them. They make me feel anxious and itchy. So I have no notifications on. And again, if somebody wants me, they can phone me. They have my number. Is that a good idea, or should we actually be on lots of different platforms?
No,
Yes.
gold star for both of those. So the first thing you were talking about, and I am so passionate about this particular topic, we need businesses, small businesses, large businesses, to articulate what I call their digital guardrails. The colloquial term I use are your tech expectations. We need to articulate internally and to our external stakeholders, particularly our clients and customers, what are our tech expectations? What are the digital norms, practices, and principles? And rather than just assume that people will know, having those clear digital borders and boundaries. In many countries throughout the world, there is now legislation around the right to disconnect. Irrespective of whether the country where you work from has that legislation, I firmly believe companies need digital guardrails. People also need their own personal digital guardrails. So absolutely gold star for that one. The second thing you talked about with notifications is that I often say we have ancient Paleolithic brains. If we go back to our human operating system, our brains are biologically designed to go and forage, hunt, and get information at a time, at a cadence, and at a volume that suited us. But in our always on digitally demanding world, what is happening now is unsolicited information is constantly being thrust at us. Our brain cannot physiologically, it can psychologically, but at a physiological level, our brain cannot differentiate between a Teams notification pinging us and a tiger chasing us. It says potential stressor or danger. This was unsolicited. It came to me, and it usually by default came in a red bubble. Red we associate with danger, urgency, importance, the fact that there's a damn metric. Yes, and that metric We have something as humans called the completion bias. So we don't want to see we've got 47 unread Teams chats. So I will triage my Teams chat so I can get that down to a respectable number, preferably a 0.
The more you send, the more you're throwing the
Snowball.
monkey onto someone else's back.
Yeah.
You're pinging someone else.
Yeah.
And it's the sand, rock, pebble analogy
Yeah.
in the sense that a lot of junior members don't think or don't know yet what rock work is. So they're just constantly doing
Yes.
sand and ping. And they think that's work. And the actual the output. And when you're saying about meetings and minutes and everything like that, no one's actually doing the actual work. So going back to that magic wand in a perfect day, what would you recommend people do?
Magic wand. First and foremost, I encourage people to, and I think this is the biggest silver lining of the pandemic, particularly for knowledge workers. I acknowledge it's a privilege not afforded often to frontline workers, but identify when you are most productive. This is biologically determined by something called your chronotype. And so your chronotype dictates what time or times of the day you are naturally most focused and alert. I call them your power zone hours. And so and this is determined by a gene, your PER3 gene. And so your chronotype dictates, are you the early bird? Are you the person that fires on all cylinders early in the morning? Or are you the night owl? Do you work better in the late afternoon? Or are you the middle of the day person? The trick is to identify your chronotype and then, as best you can, depending on the role you have, depending on any caring and domestic responsibilities that might limit your schedule flexibility, your job is to then build a fortress around your focus so that during that prime time, that mental prime time, you are not getting distracted. Research tells us that whether it's the ping of an email, whether it's chatty Kathy coming up to your desk if you're back in the office, or talkative Tom, whether it's a ruminating thought, the average adult, after we have been distracted, takes around 23 minutes and 15 seconds to get back into their deep focus state. It's called the resumption lag. So we have to ring fence those most productive hours as best we can. I have 3 golden rules with notifications. Number 1, disable non-essential notifications. Unless you're in sales, customer service, or IT support, I don't believe anyone needs email notifications.
They're built to tell you, and you'll always have another email. You don't need to know how many there are. But if you go to your inbox proactively, there will be an email for you.
Yeah.
With you on that one.
Yeah. So disable non-essential. The second tip that a lot of people don't know how to do is you can now bundle or batch your notifications to come to you at a set time. So let's say I'm using Teams or I'm on Slack and I don't want them dribbling in. And the third rule with notifications is to create a VIP list so that when you activate do not disturb or focus mode on whatever platform, on Slack, on Teams, on your email, everybody gets blocked apart from those people who might be on your VIP list. Whether you've got aging parents, children in childcare or school, a client or a colleague where you're working on a time-sensitive project and you may need to be distracted, but everybody else gets blocked. The next thing I would say to founders, if you really want to thrive in this digitally demanding world, and I know we talked about this earlier, and you've heard on previous podcasts, the super skill is to master your sleep, both quality and quantity of sleep. I often say your sleep does not impact your performance, it dictates your performance. If you are not getting good quality and quantity of sleep, you cannot focus, you cannot perform at a high level, you are primed to make more mistakes. Your prefrontal cortex, that thinking part of the brain, cannot work when you are fatigued. It will reprioritize your cognitive resources elsewhere because it hasn't had the sleep. Now, we often talk about getting enough sleep. New research actually tells us that we now think having a predictable sleep and wake time may be more important than the volume of sleep you are getting in terms of the impact on your mortality. So that's some good news, because I think we often get tricked into thinking I have to constantly be getting 8 hours. If we are more consistent with when we sleep and wake up, that can be a really positive thing. So we are biologically designed for effort and recovery. So we need to try as best we can to structure our day so that we've got that cadence and rhythm built in. And the fifth one that we spent a fair bit of time today talking about is prioritizing that default mode network, that idle time, really seeing it as a key time in your calendar to fiercely protect so that you do have time for ideation, for ideas to percolate. So they'd be my top tips.
It feels so counterintuitive when you're working for yourself. You always feel like there's more that you can do and that you should be doing more. And there's obviously a lot of pressure that you put on yourself. But social media, it's a vicious circle, will tell you that other people are doing more and doing things better than you are, and that you need to keep going. So actually that doom scrolling is awful for you in so many ways. But
Yes.
the counterintuitiveness of be bored, go for walks, don't look at your emails, do everything that everything is telling you not to do, because these systems being built for us to become addicted. That strictness that you're telling us to learn about ourselves, to protect ourselves, I think will give us so much more joy with our work going forwards. And actually, when you're rested and happier and less stressed, of course, you're then going to enjoy it more and be then more creative and enthusiastic and positive. And who wouldn't want that in their working life? And I think that's a lot of things founders forget, is that we have this luxury to create a working culture that works for us and our teams, which you don't get when you work for someone else. And that, to me, is the biggest part of starting a business. It's, yes, I can travel with it. Yes, I can work with good clients and good people, but I have the autonomy to set out my workday in a way that works for me and all of our stakeholders. But I don't think I've prioritized that enough. And what you said about is it breathing apnea? Sorry,
Yep.
email.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It really resonated, because the only thing I need to do my job well is have a voice. And when my voice goes, it stresses me out. But what you said about people holding their breath when they get to their inbox, I do that. And my shoulders go up like a cat. What you're saying today, which I find is so powerful, is you cannot ignore it, whether you want to or not. It's coming for you. Be aware, and you've got the autonomy to set yourself up for success, which I think is so exciting. And all of those tips that you shared is so useful. What would be the one thing you'd like listeners to take away from today?
I live by the mantra, prioritize the potent. My mum used to say it to me when I was growing up, and I never really, if I'm honest, really understood what it meant, let alone the impact of such a statement. But I think, again, we're in a world now where we literally can do just about anything and everything. The conscious choice to make judicious, intentional decisions about where we spend our time. I think if we're not in control of technology, technology can rob us of our three most important human resources: our time, our energy, and our attention. And so if we have got this privilege of being a founder, of creating a business and a life that we love, I want us to not only enjoy the benefits that we get from doing so, be they financial, flexibility, whatever your success metrics are, but I also think it's important to enjoy the journey. And so to me, true success is achieving whatever your success metrics look like for you, enjoying the process, and not paying a tax along. You obviously have to pay your financial taxes. Please don't get me in trouble.
That one for sure. But yeah,
Yes,
the success tax.
Don't pay the success tax. I, in my keynotes, now talk about this concept. Oliver Burkeman has written a great book called 4,000 Weeks, and it's a book about productivity, but it's around this premise that as humans, our time on Earth is finite. If we are lucky, if we have a healthy lifespan, we will have an average of 80 years, which equates to roughly 4,000 weeks in our lifetime. That means if you're one of the lucky ones, you'll have 4,000 Saturdays in your entire life. I think so many of us don't enjoy the 2,000, 1,500 Saturdays that we do have available because we are low res, powered down, depleted versions of ourselves. And so I think the onus is on us to say, yes, there are things happening in our world. Technology has been engineered to be distracting and disruptive. What can I do to structure my days, to set myself up for success, to enjoy the process as much as the final outcome that we get to? And no one's coming to save us. The onus is on us as founders to create that life that we love. And so I often talk to people about live a life by design, not by default. Particularly as entrepreneurs have defaulted back to outdated industrialized models of success and productivity.
Yeah, and do more. And I love that you're talking about this 80 years. So what we do is a question from our previous guest has a question for our next guest. And his question is, fast forward to your 80th birthday. You've created a great life and a business. You are full of wisdom from the journey you have been on. What advice would this person give you today that would help you with your current business challenges? which I
Oh,
think
what
is
a
so
good
apt.
question,
Yeah.
isn't it? And that was not set up in any
Not
way.
at all. You didn't even know that was coming. And I recorded it 6 weeks ago. And I thought at the time, God, that's really interesting. My 80-year-old self, what would they tell
Yeah.
me now that would help me with my business today? But you were just saying we have, on, if we're lucky, 80 years. So
Mm.
if Dr. Kristy Goodwin, on your 80th birthday, what would you want your 80-year-old self to tell you today to help you in your business today?
Oh, what would she tell me?
I hope, congratulations, well done. You've done an amazing thing.
I hope she could say that.
Yeah.
Uh, I think so many. For me, being an entrepreneur, the roadblocks have felt at times like mountains to climb over, and it has felt arduous and it has been relentless at times. I think it's about persevering, not necessarily pushing through, but that persevering and having that grit, but doing so in a way that is sustainable.
Yeah.
As I
Yeah.
said, enjoying the process as much as the product,
Well, that's
because
it. So many successful entrepreneurs go, I got there and then I got even further there and I can't
yeah,
take this money with me. It's actually the
yeah,
process of how I got here that I should have enjoyed more. And that was
yeah,
a real lesson of what is the end goal? Oh, there isn't. The end goal is actually in the now and enjoying the now. And that's why when you do your
and
own
not
job, you need to love it.
yes. And not
Yeah.
being that depleted, burnt out, powered down, low res version of yourself. And if you are,
Yeah.
I want to give you, the belief that things can be different. You can turn this ship around. I often say when I work with coaching clients, it's not about doing a radical overhaul. It's about embedding small little micro habits into your days that mean you are working in harmony, not in conflict with your human operating system. And so it's not convoluted, it's not complicated. It's just about making those small little 1 degree changes, those 1% differences that will have a profound impact on your life.
I love this because it's so embracive and encouraging. It's all is not lost. It can get better. And what would your
Yes.
question be for our next guest?
I would love to know, what is it that you have found powers you up and sustains you as a founder or an entrepreneur? What are the habits, the practices, the protocols, the everyday things? Because I think we often, again, we compare and despair what we're not doing on social media. I love hearing what works, but I also love hearing from people what doesn't work. That whole
Yes.
Harvard fail fast and share your failings premise, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's the podcast where it all came from because I started a business and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. It's not going to be perfect. And that is absolutely fine because the more you fail, the more you
Yes.
learn. And the more you're comfortable with failure, the better you'll be. And I was like, oh, great.
I think we dived into it today when we talked about you've got to know what your success metrics are. Like, adopting somebody else's or popularized notions of what success looks like will set you up for failure. Whereas if you say, this is what success, and be really tangible, like really concrete about what that looks like, that makes sure that you, as I said before, you're climbing the right mountain. I get work with so many people when we do some goal reprioritization and they say, oh dear,
Yeah.
I'm not meant to be on this mountain. I'm pursuing a measure of success that is not congruent with my values. And that's where people end up failing.
Exactly. Thank
Yeah.
you, Kristy, so much.
It's
This
a
has
pleasure.
been
Thank you.
absolute joy. I've learned so much and I feel really reassured in some of the things we're doing, but also some of the things that we can now change. I really hope you've enjoyed this conversation. You can find a recap of all the advice so kindly shared by our guest in the show notes, along with their contact details. We'd love it if you could rate and review or share this podcast because it really does help other people discover it. To incentivize this a little, I would very happily offer you one of our PR guides on how to share editorial coverage legally. Just DM us or send us an email, hello@fallowfieldmason.com with review in the title and we'll share it on.